Hi, I'm Brena Nath, Vice President of Events and Community here at HousingWire. This conversation is one I'm super excited about because when I first connected to Bob Simpson, who is the founder of Daylight AML, was a few months ago. And at the time, we knew this conversation was an important one to have. And even though a few months have gone by, this industry still needs this conversation when it comes to what are the known unknowns? Where's this industry going when it comes to the shifts in Washington right now, how they can stay certain, where they can find some certainties. And Bob is the person that I've been able to chat with to help bring some insights into that. But before we jump in, Bob, I wanted to start off by first saying thank you for joining me, but also you have some interesting stories that I think are great to share. For starters, your first time getting an FBI phone call for a fraudulent loan was back in 1995. That shaped a lot of your career. So I wanted to start there, where I think helps paint the picture of why you're passionate and why we're having this conversation.
You know, I don't think I've ever talked about this in public before. In 1995, I was a loan originator, and my phone rings, and it's the FBI saying, "You did a loan for Betty." And I said, "I don't recall such a loan." They said, "You better come down and talk to us." So I did. I went down. I quickly got reminded I had done a loan for Betty. Well, she slipped me fake tax returns and two other banks, one in Arizona and one in Las Vegas. And, you know, I was really glad she got those other two banks too, because it got me off the hook. I wasn't being viewed with suspicion. She was getting cash out from a number of different banks. And it's a sobering thing. And over the course of the next 20 years, I ran the largest mortgage fraud investigation company in the country for 25 years. And that lesson with the FBI always taught me that when you're looking at problem loans, let's just call them problem loans, there's a thing called relative sophistication that you have to keep in mind. How sophisticated are your borrowers? How sophisticated are the people that might be lying to you? In this particular case, she was a real estate agent and knew the game. And she got me in these two other banks. But that sort of feeling of, yeah, I got had by somebody who knows the system was pretty much foundational for my investigation techniques.
And to your point, that was probably now 30 years ago, I think, as if I'm doing the math there, for 2025 to 1995. And in that time frame, this conversation has only become more important, and it's still a top topic. So if we fast forward 30 years to today, and like how you've seen this conversation change, why is BSA, and maybe we should also start by, because I know when I jumped on this conversation, I know a lot of our key listeners at HousingWire probably know these acronyms and what they stand for, but it doesn't hurt for you to kind of spell it out when it comes to BSA, AML, compliance, and why it's important today.
All right, so let me start by defining what BSA is, the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering. It's a compliance duty, and a lot of banks and mortgage companies look at it like, oh man, another thing I have to comply with. But it has nothing to do with humda tila trid. It has nothing to do with be nice to your borrowers, be solid citizens, disclose things properly. This goes back to 1970. Richard Nixon is president of the United States. 1986, until then, money laundering wasn't even illegal. So in 86, we say that money laundering is illegal. In 2001, 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden now our focus changes to countering the financing of terrorism. So we've had these developments in these laws over time. And in 2012, the big thing happened to the mortgage industry, which is when FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a division of Treasury, decided that it does in fact apply to mortgage lenders. Until then, it was kind of a question, before 2012, does it apply? Well, it does. And so that means that every mortgage broker, every non-bank lender has got to have an adequate BSA program.
From that's a huge kind of mile marker in this space and setting that foundation. I think what I'd want to drill down into a little bit more is, why is this especially important right now? So we have the what this is. And then if you take the history there, why is this important for lenders in 2025?
To answer that question, let me go to where people screw up. when you read the consent decrees, when you read the punishments of where people went off the beam and didn't comply with BSA, it's always like the most embarrassing headlines you could possibly come up with. One big bank got in trouble because, kind of unbelievably, they let $700 million in ATM withdrawals be taken out in countries they don't even do business with. So that should have hit somebody's auto scans when you're looking at all the cash that's getting taken out in South American countries and you don't have offices there. That's the kind of thing, if you're not complying, if you're not paying attention to the details, you end up doing business with Pablo Escobar, and you don't want to do that. So sure, there are more mundane penalties than that. There are more, it's kind of interesting. I point out to people that these penalties sometimes get levied on individual officers of the companies. There was a $400,000 penalty that got levied on a BSA officer individually. So it's not just corporate problems. There are mundane fines and problems, but there are also really bad headlines that can come when you get caught not complying or kind of not caring.
Right now, you take this, we have a shift in the White House administration. People are looking for where they can get some certainty on. There's a lot of shifts in what regulation to pay attention to, especially when it comes to anti-money laundering. What are some of the biggest uncertainties and regulatory shifts that are keeping lenders up at night? And then what would your response be to how to move forward in that uncertainty?
Okay, so you're right. There are some real uncertainties that have sprung up since the new administration came in. First, when they say we're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That was the first thing. We're not going to really go after people who are paying bribes. The next thing they did was to say that under the Corporate Transparency Act, the CTA, they aren't going to require domestic companies to file that report called the BOI, the Beneficial Ownership Information Report, in which you disclose who owns your company. Now, let me explain why that's just way out of step with the rest of the world. If you pay attention at all to the financial intelligence units, or there's a voluntary Paris-based organization called the FATF, Financial Action Task Force. Every non-rogue nation is a member of it. And they came out with 40 recommendations to be good citizens, to have a good BSA program. And one of the chief concerns around the world is preventing shell companies from the transferring purchase and ownership of real estate. And when we came out as a nation and just said, we are not going to require domestic companies to disclose who owns the companies, we're going to require foreign companies to disclose, but not domestic. It was kind of a collective gasp, a record scratch moment around the world, because every non-rogue nation is trying to prevent anonymous transfers of property. They get a grade at the FATF. Every nation gets a grade on these 40 recommendations. And just by way of interest, Ireland, tremendous grades. Everything's transparent in Ireland. You can't buy or sell real estate without absolutely knowing who's involved. It gets the top grade. A little below that is France. They keep the same records, but they charge to access the database. So when they're keeping records of who's more, transparent, it's not France because they charge. We get graded along with everybody else. And what I want to convey to everyone is that just because the Corporate Transparency Act is not requiring you to disclose, that does not relieve you of your duty to refrain from doing business with drug lords and human traffickers. You have to know who you are dealing with. So just because the companies don't have to disclose doesn't mean you are relieved of your obligation to do your KYC, your know your customer. So just because of the one action on the CTA doesn't mean you're off the hook for doing business with prohibited people.
Wrapping up my last two questions kind of together, because I really want people to know what to do with that. You just laid out why it's important. I mean, this industry is known to have overlays to make sure that you are watching your risk and your compliances with you, even your own appetite as a company. For you, whether you are looking at a small lender who maybe doesn't have full compliance teams that are trying to solve for this, to a larger IMB who's also trying to digest what to do with still seeing the importance of this conversation, what are 1 to 2 practical pieces and takeaways that you'd give, whether it's a small lender or maybe you bifurcate kind of your comments on small lenders versus big lenders, and like, okay, what do they do?
All right, so let me give you 3 things. One is the person that you appoint to be your BSA officer can have other jobs. So you don't need to hire somebody specifically to handle this. They just have to have enough time to do the job. So you can appoint, could be your broker of record if you're a small shop. Second, let me direct you to a free resource, which is my website, Daylight AML. There's a lot of video content there that you can get for free. You don't have to pay me for that. And the third thing I want to mention is that in tough times, people cheat. So if times are a little tougher right now, people have car payments, they have house payments, they have the big car. There are actions people take to get deals done now in tougher markets that they wouldn't have had to have taken 2 years ago. So be aware of what's out there. It can be increasing. Fraud can be increasing.
Thank you, Bob, for listing out those 3 things. This is a conversation that I know is it's important, but it's also an ongoing one. So thanks for noting those free resources and ways that people can learn more, because this conversation is shifting and evolving and what people are looking for is growing. So thank you, Bob. Appreciate having you on 10-Minute Talks.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.